This isn't another story about heroes saving the galaxy. This is about the billions of souls who live and die in the shadow of war, toil, and fanaticism. We're pulling back the curtain on the true, unvarnished existence of a civilian in Segmentum Solar, a life far grimmer than you've ever imagined. I was born in the darkness of Hive Tertius on a world whose name I never learned to pronounce properly. A syllable, jumble of High Gothic that the overseers barked through vox grillies during shift changes. My first memory is not of my mother's face or father's voice, but of the grinding thunder of the manufactorum wheels, a sound so constant and pervasive that silence itself became a source of anxiety in those rare moments when the machines stopped for maintenance. The air in the hab, block where I spent my childhood, tasted of recycled sweat and machine oil, a combination that coated the back of your throat and never quite washed away no matter how much reclaimed water you drank. We were fortunate, they told us, to live within 5 kilometers of the primary water reclamation facility. Some habs on the lower levels went weeks between water rations, and the children there grew up with skin like parchment and eyes that seemed too large for their sunken faces. My mother worked the nutrient-paste refineries on the 207th level, a position she inherited from her mother, who inherited it from hers, stretching back through generations until the origin of our family's service was lost in the administrative records of millennia past. She would return to our hab unit after her 16-hour shift with her hair matted to her skull and her coveralls stained with the gray-green residue of processed algae and synthesized protein compounds. The smell that clung to her was indescribable, something that existed between rot and chemical sterility, and it filled our 3-meter square living space until we could taste it in our sleep. She never complained. Complaint was tantamount to questioning the Emperor's divine order, and questioning led to investigation. And investigation led to places from which people did not return. I learned this truth before I learned to read, absorbed it through the fearful glances exchanged between adults when the Adeptus Arbites patrol servitors shambled past our hab, block entrance with their multi-spectral scanners sweeping for signs of sedition or heresy. The manufactorum where I was eventually assigned at age 12 produced shell casings for the Astra Militarum, millions upon millions of brass cylinders that would one day hold the explosive fury that kept the Imperium's enemies at bay. The work was simple in concept but devastating in execution. I stood at Station 739 Alpha for 12 hours each day, my hands guiding raw metal ingots into the stamping press while the machine's hydraulic arms descended with enough force to pulverize bone if you mistook the rhythm even once. The heat from the forges turned the air into something visible, wavering curtains of thermal distortion that made the far end of the factory floor seem like another world entirely. Sweat poured from every pore within minutes of beginning a shift, and the salt stung in the countless small cuts and abrasions that accumulated on your hands despite the thin gloves they issued us once every 3 months. Those gloves wore through in weeks, but you learned to make do, wrapping your fingers in scraps of cloth torn from worn-out coveralls, or, if you were truly desperate, strips of synthetic leather peeled from the seats of broken down transport servitors that occasionally collapsed in the corridors. The quota boards dominated the eastern wall of the manufactorum, vast panels of flickering amber numerals that tracked production output for every station, every worker, every shift. Green numbers meant you met the minimum requirement, the baseline that kept you classified as productive and therefore worthy of continued food rations and hab space allocation. Amber meant you were adequate but unremarkable, neither celebrated nor threatened. Red meant you had failed to meet your quota, and red numbers beside your designation code brought consequences that escalated with terrifying precision. First infraction resulted in a 10% reduction in your weekly nutrient paste allotment, a cut that left you constantly hollow and weak. Second infraction brought mandatory supplementary shifts without additional rations. 36 hours of continuous labor that left workers swaying at their stations like corpses animated by nothing but habit and fear. Third infraction meant reassignment, a word that everyone understood to be a euphemism for something far worse than mere labor. The reassigned vanished into the lower hive levels, sent to work the plasma refineries or the waste reclamation pits, where the expected survival duration was measured in months rather than years, or they were shipped off world to penal colonies on airless moons, where convict labor carved out ore deposits in environments that would kill an unprotected human in seconds. Food was the currency of survival more than the throne gelt that clinked in our pockets on the rare occasions we received any. The nutrient paste dispensaries operated on a strict schedule coordinated with shift changes, and missing your designated collection window meant going without until the next cycle. The paste itself defied description in conventional culinary terms. It possessed the consistency of wet clay, colored a gray, brown that suggested organic origin without confirming it, and tasted of minerals and something vaguely protein, rich that your tongue recognized as edible without being able to identify it as any specific food source. It came in 3 classifications based on your productivity rating and civic contribution score. Standard paste, which I subsisted on for most of my youth, provided the minimum caloric intake necessary to maintain basic physiological function. Enhanced paste, reserved for overperformers and those with specialized skills, included trace vitamins and occasionally possessed a flavor additive that made it almost palatable. Premium paste, a luxury I encountered only once in my entire life when a clerical error temporarily elevated my civic score, contained actual protein derived from vermin stock raised in the hive's deep agricultural sectors. Tasting it was like discovering that food could be something other than merely functional. The distribution centers themselves were monuments to the Imperium's brutal efficiency, vast halls lined with thousands of dispensing stations where workers queued for hours to collect their allotment. The servitors who operated the dispensaries had once been human, though little remained of that origin beyond the basic skeletal structure, now encased in chrome and cable. Their faces, what remained of them, had been replaced with vox grilles and optical sensors, and their arms terminated in precise dispensing nozzles that measured out exactly 400 grams of paste into the battered plasteel containers we carried with us everywhere. The servitors never spoke, never acknowledged the humans they served, simply processed each citizen's identification chit with mechanical precision and dispensed the allotted portion before moving to the next person in line. You learned not to look at them too closely, not to wonder who they might have been before augmentation, because that path led to questions that had no safe answers. Starvation was not a dramatic thing in the hives of Segmentum Solar. It did not strike suddenly or announce itself with theatrical suffering. It was a slow erosion, a gradual diminishment that transformed vital humans into hollow shells over months and years. You saw it in the workers whose coveralls hung loose on frames that seemed to shrink a little more each week, in the children whose growth stunted until they reached adulthood standing no taller than they had been at 12, in the elderly who simply failed to wake one morning after their caloric intake fell below the threshold necessary to sustain basic organ function. The corpse collection servitors made their rounds through the hab blocks every morning, their tracked bodies navigating the narrow corridors with surprising grace as they scanned for biological signatures that had ceased during the night. They took the dead without ceremony, loading them into disposal containers that would transport them to the reclamation facilities where every molecule of organic material would be recovered and processed back into the system. Nothing was wasted in the Imperium. Death itself was simply another resource to be efficiently harvested and redistributed. Water came from the reclamation plants that processed every drop of liquid in the hive through a series of filters and purification stages that rendered it technically potable. though the taste of minerals and residual chemical treatments lingered no matter how thoroughly it was processed. We received our water rations twice weekly, delivered through the communal taps that occupied the center of each hab block cluster. The taps operated on a timer system flowing for exactly 30 minutes during designated collection periods, and if you missed your window, you either went without or traded something of value to a neighbor for a share of their allotment. The water always carried a faint metallic aftertaste and sometimes contained visible particles of sediment that settled to the bottom of whatever container you stored it in. But it was water, and water meant life, so you drank it and were grateful. The alternative was the black market water that occasionally circulated through the lower levels, sourced from the condensation collectors that gathered moisture from the hive's vast atmospheric recyclers. And that water carried risks that far outweighed its marginal improvement in taste. Contamination was common in unsanctioned water sources, bacterial colonies, and chemical pollutants that could leave you curled on your sleeping pallet for days with your insides trying to purge themselves. And if you were unlucky enough to contract one of the truly virulent strains, the infection would kill you long before any medical facility would accept someone of your station for treatment. Medical care existed in theory, codified in the extensive legal framework that governed every aspect of imperial citizenship, but the reality of accessing it depended entirely on your value to the system. The medicus stations that served the manufactorum districts operated on a traj system that prioritized workers based on their productivity ratings and the relative ease of returning them to functional status. A broken finger that could be splinted and healed within weeks received treatment. A chronic respiratory condition caused by years of breathing recycled air thick with industrial particulates was deemed an acceptable degradation of capability that did not warrant the resources necessary for proper treatment. I watched my mother develop a cough during my 14th year, a wet rattling sound that emerged from deep in her chest and grew progressively worse with each passing month. She continued working her shifts because stopping meant losing her position, and with it our hab space allocation, continued standing in the sweltering heat of the refinery while her lungs slowly filled with fluid and scar tissue. When she finally collapsed during a shift, the manufactorum medici took one look at her scan results and classified her condition as terminal with treatment costs exceeding her remaining productive value. They gave her a single dose of pain suppressants and sent her back to our hab unit to die. It took 3 more weeks. 3 weeks of watching her struggle for each breath while her skin took on a grayish pallor, and her body seemed to shrink into itself. The corpse collection servitor came for her on a morning when the manufactorum had shut down for emergency maintenance, and I was present to watch as they loaded her wasted form into their disposal container with the same mechanical indifference they showed every other body. Just another unit of organic material to be efficiently processed and returned to the system. The Adeptus Ministorum maintained prayer halls throughout the hive levels, vast chambers where workers were encouraged to gather during their designated rest periods to offer devotion to the god. Emperor of mankind. Attendance was theoretically voluntary, but your civic contribution score received favorable adjustments for regular participation, and those adjustments meant the difference between standard and enhanced nutrient paste, between a hab unit in a relatively maintained sector and one in the lower levels where the air recyclers function sporadically and the darkness pressed in during power conservation cycles. The halls themselves were architecturally impressive despite their utilitarian construction, soaring ceilings supported by columns inscribed with devotional text in High Gothic and Low Gothic and a dozen other languages accumulated over millennia of imperial expansion. The altar at the chamber's far end bore the imperial aquila wrought in bronze and gold, wings spread in eternal vigilance, and before it stood the preachers who delivered sermons about sacrifice and duty, and the transcendent glory of serving the Emperor's divine will. The sermons followed predictable patterns, variations on themes that had echoed through these halls for generations. The Emperor protects, they told us, but protection required sacrifice. The security of the Imperium rested on the backs of countless billions who toiled in obscurity, whose names would never be recorded in the great histories, but whose labor formed the foundation upon which humanity's survival depended. Every shell casing I stamped brought death to mankind's enemies. Every minute of productivity contributed to a war effort that spanned the galaxy. My suffering, your suffering, all our suffering held meaning and purpose within the vast machinery of imperial might. The preachers spoke with genuine fervor, their voices amplified through vox systems that made their words seem to emanate from the very walls, and watching them I wondered if they truly believed what they preached, or if they too were simply components, performing their designated function within the system. Doubt was heresy, of course, and heresy meant investigation, so I kept such thoughts locked behind my teeth and mouthed the required responses when the congregation recited the litany of duty. Fear was the unspoken foundation of everything. Fear more pervasive than the machine, sound that filled our days or the taste of recycled air that coated our throats. Fear of failing to meet quota. Fear of drawing the attention of the overseers. Fear of the Adeptus Arbites, who maintained order through the implicit threat of overwhelming violence. Fear of the whispered rumors about what happened in the interrogation chambers deep beneath the precinct fortresses where suspects vanished and emerged as different people, or did not emerge at all. The Imperium functioned through the application of calculated terror, a system where every citizen understood that their continued existence depended on maintaining their utility to the machine and avoiding any behavior that might be interpreted as deviance from acceptable parameters. You learn to watch your words, to monitor your thoughts for dangerous patterns, to report suspicious behavior in your neighbors before someone reported yours, because survival meant participating in the mechanisms of your own oppression. The children born in the hives grew up understanding these truths instinctively, absorbing the rules of survival through observation long before they were old enough to comprehend the philosophical implications. I remember watching a boy of perhaps 6 years old playing in the narrow space between HAB units, entertaining himself with a game that involved arranging bits of scrap metal into patterns. He was singing to himself, some childish melody that had survived transmission from earlier generations, and his voice carried the innocent joy that children somehow maintained even in this environment. Then an overseer's patrol passed through the corridor, and the boy fell silent mid-note, freezing in place with his eyes downcast until the heavy footsteps faded. He remained motionless for several seconds after they disappeared from view, then slowly returned to his game. But the singing did not resume. He had learned the lesson that all of us learned eventually: joy itself was a luxury that could attract unwanted attention. And attention meant danger. The HAB units where we lived were marvels of space optimization and simultaneously monuments to humanity's capacity for enduring squalor. Mine measured 3 meters by 3 meters by 2.5 meters tall. Dimensions I knew precisely because they were stenciled on the access panel beside the door along with our unit designation code and the maximum occupancy rating of 4 standard mass adults. My mother and I occupied it for years, and after her death I continued living there alone until my eventual reassignment. The walls were corrugated plasteel that conducted temperature poorly, rendering the unit sweltering during the manufactorum's operational cycles and chilling during the maintenance periods when the heating systems were powered down to conserve energy. A single light fixture embedded in the ceiling provided illumination, though the lumens it generated were barely sufficient for reading the production reports I occasionally brought back from my shift. The sleeping pallets folded down from the wall, thin mattresses of compressed synthetic fibers that offered minimal cushioning against the hard plasteel frame. A small ablution alcove occupied one corner, containing a water tap that functioned during designated hours, and a waste disposal unit that evacuated directly into the Hive's sanitation system. The air came through a vent near the ceiling, pushed by circulation fans somewhere in the infrastructure, and it always carried the same combination of industrial odor and organic decay that characterized the entire district. Privacy was a concept that existed primarily in theory. The walls between HAB units were thin enough that you heard your neighbors' conversations, their arguments, their intimate moments, their coughs and tears, and desperate prayers offered in the darkness when they thought no one could hear. You learned to ignore these sounds, or at least pretend to ignore them, because acknowledging them meant acknowledging the complete absence of personal space that characterized our existence. The communal corridors served as de facto social spaces where residents gathered during their off shifts, sitting on the floor with their backs against the walls, while they shared rumors and complaints in voices carefully modulated to avoid carrying beyond the immediate group. These gatherings operated in a constant state of paranoid awareness, every participant monitoring for signs of informants or surveillance equipment, ready to disperse the moment anything seemed suspicious. Trust was a rare commodity, carefully rationed and never fully extended, because everyone knew that desperation could transform anyone into an informant, trading their neighbor's indiscretion for a temporary improvement in their own circumstances. The black market that operated in the shadows of the official distribution system represented the only real avenue for improving your material conditions beyond what the quota system provided. It flourished despite the Adeptus Arbites' efforts to suppress it, a resilient network of traders and smugglers who moved contraband goods through the HAB, blocks, and manufactorum districts with surprising efficiency. The contraband ranged from the relatively innocuous, extra rations of nutrient paste or slightly worn clothing that had been declared surplus to requirements, to the actively dangerous, bootleg recaf stimulants that could keep you alert through double shifts, but also carried the risk of cardiac arrest if you misjudged the dosage, or counterfeit identification chits that promised access to restricted areas but would trigger instant arrest if scanned by legitimate security systems. I participated in this economy cautiously, occasionally trading a portion of my water ration for a few grams of actual flavoring powder that made the nutrient paste briefly tolerable. Aware that each transaction represented a risk, but unable to resist the temporary reprieve from the grinding monotony of officially sanctioned sustenance. The most valuable commodity in the black market was information, particularly information about upcoming inspections or changes to the quota system, or which overseers were susceptible to looking the other way in exchange for considerations. A worker who possessed reliable information could trade it for substantial improvements in their circumstances, accumulating enough favors to secure better HAB space or access to enhanced rations or even, in rare cases, recommendations for transfer to less hazardous assignments. The information brokers who controlled these networks occupied positions of peculiar power within the social hierarchy, respected and feared in equal measure because they could elevate you or destroy you with equal facility. I knew one such broker, a woman named Kella, who had survived 40 years in the manufactorum through a combination of shrewd dealings and careful management of her reputation. She occupied a HAB unit that had somehow been expanded to twice the standard size, walls knocked out and combined with adjoining units through methods she never explained. And workers sought her out when they needed something, beyond what the official channels could provide. She would sit in her expanded space, surrounded by her accumulated possessions, genuine furniture scavenged from decommissioned administrative offices and a functioning water heater that produced warm ablutions, and she would listen to your request with eyes that calculated value and risk with mechanical precision before naming her price. Violence was omnipresent but rarely dramatic, a constant background element like the machine, sound that filled our days. Bar fights erupted in the recaf halls where workers gathered during rest shifts. Brief explosions of rage born from accumulated stress and exhaustion that the Adeptus Arbites broke up with casual brutality before they could escalate into something requiring lethal force. Domestic violence permeated the hab blocks, the sounds of impact and shouting bleeding through thin walls to assault the ears of neighbors who had learned long ago not to intervene because intervention meant involvement and involvement meant investigation. Gangs controlled various sectors of the lower levels, organizations that had evolved beyond simple criminal enterprises into quasi-governmental structures that provided their own form of order in areas where official imperial authority had effectively withdrawn. These gangs extracted protection fees from local vendors and residents, but they also maintained a rough justice system that settled disputes and punished those who preyed on their community, and in some ways their presence provided more reliable security than the intermittent Arbites patrols that swept through periodically to remind everyone of who ultimately held power. The truly horrific violence, the kind that transcended the mundane brutality of daily existence, occurred in the manufactorums during accidents that the overseers classified as inevitable consequences of industrial-scale production. I witnessed my first such incident during my third year at Station 739 Alpha, when a worker 2 rows over mistimed the rhythm of his stamping press, and his hand entered the kill zone a fraction of a second before the hydraulic arm descended. The sound was distinctive, a wet crunch that carried over the general cacophony of machine operation, followed by screaming that reached a pitch I had not known the human voice could achieve. The hydraulic arm rose on its pre-programmed cycle, revealing what remained of the man's hand, compressed into a flat mass of pulverized bone and tissue that still maintained a vague hand-like shape. The overseers responded with practiced efficiency, shutting down his station and summoning a medici servitor that cauterized the stump with thermal instruments while the man screamed and eventually passed into unconsciousness from shock and pain. Production at surrounding stations continued without interruption because stopping would have affected the quota numbers, and after the medicus servitor transported the injured worker away, a replacement was assigned to his station within the hour. We never saw the injured man again. His name disappeared from the quota board, and his HAB unit was reassigned before the end of the week, the system efficiently processing his removal and replacement with the same mechanical indifference it showed all aspects of labor management. Death in the manufactorums came in countless varieties beyond simple mechanical accidents. Heat exhaustion claimed workers during summer cycles when the external temperature combined with forge output to push ambient conditions past the point where human physiology could maintain equilibrium. Chemical exposure from improperly sealed containers or faulty ventilation systems would kill slowly, workers developing respiratory distress or neurological symptoms that progressively worsened until they could no longer function. Explosions occurred periodically when volatile materials were mishandled or storage protocols were violated in the endless pressure to maintain production rates. Fireballs that incinerated everything within their blast radius and left only scorched shadows where humans had stood seconds before. The administration maintained meticulous records of these fatalities, tracking casualty rates against production output to optimize the balance between worker safety and manufacturing efficiency, and those calculations determined how many deaths were considered acceptable losses within normal operational parameters. The weather, when we saw it at all, was an abstraction. The upper levels of the Hive possessed observation decks, where citizens with sufficient civic contribution scores could pay a small fee to spend 30 minutes gazing through armored transparent steel at the world beyond the walls. I saved enough thrown gelt to make the journey exactly twice in my life, climbing through dozens of levels via cargo elevators and maintenance stairwells until I reached the observation tier. The view through those windows revealed a landscape that seemed fundamentally alien to someone who had spent their entire existence inside processed air and artificial light. The sky was a brown, gray expanse, thick with industrial pollution that turned the sun into a dim red circle that provided illumination without warmth. The ground far below was invisible beneath the hive's sprawling foundation. Kilometers of rockcrete and plasteel that spread across the planetary surface like a metallic fungus. Other hives rose in the distance, massive structures that stretched toward the heavens like the fingers of a buried giant, their sides studded with millions of lights that marked hab blocks and manufactorums identical to the ones where I spent my days. No vegetation was visible anywhere, no hint of organic life beyond humanity and the food stock we cultivated in controlled environments. The world had been transformed entirely into an engine of production, its natural features buried beneath layers of construction, accumulated over millennia. And standing at that window, I understood with visceral clarity that this was humanity's future, this endless expansion of industrial infrastructure until every world in the Imperium became nothing but factory and foundry and forge. The concept of family existed, but operated under constraints that would have been unrecognizable to humanity's ancient ancestors. Marriage was encouraged as a means of producing the next generation of workers, and modest civic contribution bonuses were offered to couples who formally registered their union through the administratum. Children were assets, future laborers whose value began accruing from the moment they reached working age, and families that produced multiple offspring received slightly enhanced rations to support the additional caloric requirements. But the bonds between family members remained constantly vulnerable to the system's demands. Children were routinely reassigned to manufactorums in different sectors, or even different hives based on labor requirements. And once reassignment occurred, maintaining contact became virtually impossible. No communication infrastructure existed for personal messages between hive districts, no postal service or Vox network that ordinary citizens could access. Families separated by reassignment simply ceased to exist as functional units, becoming memories that faded over years and eventually generations until lineage itself became little more than a few names recorded in administratum genealogy databases that no one would ever access. Love persisted despite everything, that peculiar human capacity for emotional attachment that manifested even in the most hostile environments. I watched couples form in the manufactorums, workers who met during shifts and developed genuine affection through stolen conversations during maintenance breaks and shared ration portions when one fell ill. These relationships existed in defiance of every practical consideration, offering no material benefit and often creating vulnerabilities that the system could exploit. Yet they persisted because humans needed connection more desperately than we needed safety, needed to believe that we were more than simply components in the machine. I experienced it myself once, with a woman named Sarah who worked the chem vat stirrers 3 levels below my station. We met during a shift overlap, began talking during our shared meal break, and over weeks developed something that transcended the merely transactional relationships that characterized most social interactions. She laughed at my observations about the absurdities of quota calculations, shared her dreams about saving enough to access the upper-level observation decks, held my hand in the darkness of my hab unit while we listened to our neighbors through the thin walls and pretended we were somewhere else. It lasted 4 months before she was reassigned to an off-world facility that was expanding production of armor plating for the naval dockyards in orbit. We said goodbye in the cargo transport staging area, surrounded by hundreds of other workers being shipped to various destinations across the system. And I never saw her again. The absence she left felt like a physical wound, an emptiness that took years to finally calcify into scar tissue. Entertainment existed in forms so debased that calling them entertainment seemed generous. The holo, casters that occupied public spaces in the recaf halls and communal corridors, broadcast programming produced by the Departamento Munitorum. Endless streams of propaganda that depicted heroic Imperial Guard regiments crushing Xenos threats and loyal workers rejoicing in their service to the God Emperor. The production values were surprisingly competent, the images crisp, and the narratives constructed with sufficient dramatic tension to maintain attention. But the content was so obviously manufactured that even the most credulous viewer understood they were watching carefully curated fiction rather than documentary truth. Still, we watched because there was nothing else to watch, because seeing any images beyond the monotonous industrial landscape of our immediate environment provided relief, even when we knew those images were lies designed to pacify and control us. The most popular form of genuine entertainment was storytelling, the ancient human practice of sharing narratives that had persisted across millennia and continued thriving in the Hive despite the Ministerum's suspicion of unauthorized cultural transmission. Older workers who had accumulated decades of experience possessed repertoires of stories that they shared during rest periods, tales that mixed historical fragments with exaggeration and pure invention until fact and fiction became impossible to distinguish. Some stories described the legendary Space Marines, warrior, angels who supposedly defended humanity from threats so terrible that ordinary humans could not even comprehend their nature. Other stories whispered about the Age of Strife, that pre-imperial era when humanity had nearly destroyed itself before the Emperor's emergence to unite our species and guide us toward salvation. The best storytellers commanded genuine respect within the community, their ability to craft narratives that transported listeners beyond their immediate circumstances, representing a form of wealth more valuable than any material possession. I remember an old man named Jorah who worked the quality inspection stations, his hands too gnarled with arthritis to perform heavy labor, but his mind still sharp. He would gather listeners in the corners of the recaf halls and spin tales about worlds he had supposedly visited during his youth. Planets where water fell from the sky and plant life grew wild without cultivation, where humans lived in structures called houses that contained dozens of rooms and air that smelled of living things rather than recycled chemistry. Whether any of his stories contained truth was impossible to verify, but truth was less important than the brief escape they provided from our reality. Religion permeated every aspect of existence, though the faith we practiced bore little resemblance to the sophisticated theological frameworks maintained by the ecclesiarchy's high clergy. Our understanding of the God Emperor came filtered through the simplified catechisms delivered during mandatory prayer sessions, a theology reduced to basic principles that required no education to comprehend. The Emperor was humanity's protector and lord, the greatest being ever to exist, who had sacrificed his own comfort to sit upon the golden throne and shield us from extinction. Our duty was simple work: obey, have faith, and die knowing that our service contributed to his eternal vigil. Questions about the nature of divinity or the specifics of imperial history were discouraged not through explicit prohibition, but through the simple fact that no resources existed to answer them. No libraries were accessible to ordinary citizens, no theological texts available for study. Faith was meant to be felt rather than understood, an emotional conviction that sustained you through hardship rather than an intellectual framework that explained the cosmos. Yet, despite this official simplicity, or perhaps because of it, folk beliefs proliferated throughout the Hive levels. Workers developed elaborate rituals to ensure quota success, small prayers or gestures performed before beginning a shift that supposedly invoked the Emperor's blessing on their labor. Some swore that certain Hab units were blessed, while others were cursed, that you could improve your fortune by hanging crude Aquila symbols above your door or placing offerings of nutrient paste in the corners of your living space. The overseers and Ministerum preachers tolerated these practices so long as they did not interfere with productivity or edge into territory that might be classified as heresy. The line between acceptable devotion and heretical deviation was never clearly defined, deliberately maintained as an ambiguous boundary that kept everyone in a constant state of uncertainty about whether their practices might attract investigation. This uncertainty served as another form of control, ensuring that religious expression remained cautious and conventional rather than innovative or questioning. The truly desperate sometimes turned to unauthorized faiths, worship practices that existed in the shadows of the official imperial creed and promised power or salvation through means the manufactorum deemed heretical. I learned about these cults through whispered rumors rather than direct exposure. Stories about workers who had vanished after attending secret gatherings in the Hive's deep reaches where forgotten spaces provided refuge from surveillance. The specifics varied with each telling, but the patterns were consistent. Someone would claim to have discovered ancient knowledge, secrets about the true nature of reality, or methods for accessing power beyond what the Imperium acknowledged. They would recruit followers through carefully worded invitations, building small congregations that met in darkness and conducted rituals that supposedly granted blessings or visions or communion with forces that existed beyond the material realm. These cults never lasted long. The Adeptus Arbites maintained extensive informant networks that penetrated even the most secretive organizations, and when they identified heretical activity, their response was absolute. Entire Hab blocks would be sealed and purged, everyone inside executed without trial or even investigation to determine individual guilt, because the mere presence in a space tainted by heresy was sufficient to warrant death. The bodies would be processed through the reclamation facilities like any other organic waste, and new workers would be assigned to the cleared Hab units within days, the system efficiently eliminating the contamination and continuing its operation without meaningful interruption. Age brought no comfort or relief in the hives of Segmentum Solar. The elderly who survived past their productive years existed in a liminal state, no longer required for labor quotas, but not yet dead, occupying space and consuming resources without providing return value to the system. Some managed to secure positions in roles that required experience rather than physical capability, becoming trainers who instructed new workers or record keepers who maintained the endless documentation that the administratum required. Others survived through the charity of younger family members who shared their rations and Hab space. Though this charity created burdens that could become unsustainable when resources were already stretched to their limits. The least fortunate simply waited for death in the communal areas of their Hab blocks, sitting against walls with eyes that had seen too much and bodies too depleted to continue functioning much longer. No retirement existed, no social safety network that provided for those who could no longer work. You labored until you physically could not continue, and then you died, and the system processed your remains and assigned your former position to someone younger. I am older now than I ever expected to become, approaching 40 standard years in an environment where that represents genuine longevity. My hands carry the scars of 3 decades at the stamping press, fingers slightly crooked from breaks that healed improperly, and skin thickened into calluses that could probably turn aside a blade. My lungs labor with each breath, damaged by years of inhaling industrial particulates that no filtration system could completely eliminate. I qualified for reassignment to a training position 2 years ago, granted this role because my consistent quota performance demonstrated reliability and my survival suggested valuable experience. Now I teach new workers the rhythms of the machinery, show them how to position their bodies to minimize fatigue and how to read the press's pre-descent indicators to avoid the injuries that claimed so many of their predecessors. The work is easier physically but harder emotionally, because I watch each new generation arrive with eyes that still hold some spark of individuality and watch that spark systematically crushed over months and years until they become what I became. what everyone becomes, another component in the machine that grinds on endlessly. Sometimes during the night periods when the manufactorums run on reduced crews and the hive settles into its closest approximation of quiet, I lie on my sleeping pallet and think about the vast scope of the Imperium we serve. Somewhere beyond this hive, beyond this world, beyond the borders of Segmentum Solar entirely, wars rage on scales I cannot truly comprehend. Entire planets burn. Billions die in conflicts that will never be mentioned in the propaganda broadcasts we receive. The space marines that the storytellers describe probably do exist somewhere, fighting enemies so terrible that we are never told their names, lest the knowledge itself corrupt us. The God Emperor sits upon the golden throne on distant Terra, and 10,000 souls are supposedly sacrificed daily to maintain his divine vigil, though whether this is literal truth or metaphorical representation remains unclear to someone of my station. My life, my mother's life, Sarah's life, the lives of everyone I have ever known, all of it amounts to less than a rounding error in the calculations that govern the Imperium's continued existence. We are the foundation, the uncounted and unremembered masses whose aggregate labor makes everything else possible, and our reward for this service is exactly what I have described: survival at the edge of sustainability, existence stripped of everything except work and faith, and the grinding hope that our suffering means something. The younger workers sometimes ask me if it gets easier, if you eventually grow accustomed to the conditions and find peace in acceptance. I tell them what they need to hear, that faith sustains us and duty provides meaning, and the Emperor protects those who serve loyally. But the truth I never speak aloud, because speaking it would be admitting what we all know but dare not acknowledge, is that it never gets easier. You never truly accept it. You simply learn to continue functioning despite the weight that presses down on every moment. Learn to compartmentalize the despair and focus on the immediate task of surviving the next shift, the next day, the next week. You learn to take whatever small pleasures you can find, a slightly better batch of nutrient paste, or a few minutes of conversation with someone who makes you laugh, or a story well told that transports you briefly beyond these walls. You learn that hope is a luxury you cannot afford but cannot entirely abandon, because abandoning it means accepting that this is all there is and all there will ever be, and that acceptance leads to the kind of despair that ends with you stepping into the stamping press during a moment when the overseers are looking elsewhere. The infrastructure that sustains us is simultaneously miracle and nightmare. A vast network of pipes and cables and ventilation shafts that extends through every centimeter of habitable space. The air we breathe has been recycled through scrubbers and filters so many times that its molecular composition probably bears little resemblance to anything natural. Stripped of contaminants and reconstituted with oxygen extracted from chemical processes I do not understand. The water flowing through the reclamation systems has passed through human bodies countless times, filtered and purified, and returned to circulation in an endless loop that has continued for centuries, or perhaps millennia. Every substance we consume or excrete or exhale becomes raw material for the system to process and redistribute. We live inside a closed ecology that functions with terrifying efficiency, where waste is impossible because everything is resource and resource is everything. The hive is a living organism in its own right, and we are the cells that comprise its body, individual components whose death means nothing so long as the organism continues functioning. The architecture itself seems designed to crush the spirit as effectively as it shelters the body. Corridors stretch for kilometers without variation. Identical plasteel walls marked only by stenciled designation codes that mean nothing to anyone not trained in administrative notation systems. The HAB blocks rise in towers that extend from the hive bottom to heights where the air pressure changes noticeably. Hundreds of thousands of units stacked in configurations that maximize occupancy while minimizing wasted space. No aesthetic consideration influences the design. Beauty is irrelevant, comfort is inefficiency, and inefficiency is heresy against the Emperor's divine order. Everything exists purely for function, and that function is to house the maximum number of workers in the minimum amount of space while maintaining just enough survivability to preserve the labor force. The result is an environment that actively drains humanity from those who inhabit it. Spaces so relentlessly hostile to individual flourishing that you feel yourself diminishing simply by existing within them. Navigation through the Hive requires knowledge accumulated over years, mental maps built from experience, because no comprehensive guide exists for ordinary citizens. The layout follows logic dictated by industrial requirements rather than human convenience, with production facilities located according to optimal resource distribution and waste management efficiency rather than any consideration for the workers who must traverse them. I know routes between my hab unit and my manufactorum that shave precious minutes from the commute, passages through maintenance corridors and cargo transport zones that technically violate access restrictions, but which the overseers ignore so long as you do not interfere with operations. Other workers guard their own secret paths, efficient routes that become valuable knowledge tradable on the informal market for favors and considerations. Getting lost in the Hive's deep reaches remains a genuine danger. Spaces where signage has degraded or never existed and corridors branch into labyrinthine complexity that can leave you wandering for hours or days until starvation and dehydration claim you. The corpse collection servitors sometimes retrieve bodies from these forgotten areas, workers who took a wrong turn and never found their way back, and their deaths are recorded as administrative losses without investigation or ceremony. The sounds of the Hive create a symphony of industrial despair that provides the constant soundtrack to existence. The deep rumble of the primary generators that power the district vibrates through every surface, a subsonic pulse you feel in your bones before you consciously hear it. The shriek of metal on metal from thousands of manufactorums blends into a single sustained note that shifts in pitch based on production cycles. The hiss of steam venting from pressure relief valves punctuates the background noise at irregular intervals, explosive bursts that make newcomers jump but which veterans ignore entirely. The shuffle of millions of feet moving through corridors during shift changes creates a sound like rainfall, and the constant coughing of workers whose lungs labor against contaminated air provides a wet, percussive element that never entirely ceases. At night, when production reduces to maintenance, only operations, the sound shifts to something different, but no less oppressive, a quiet that is not true silence, but rather the absence of the loudest elements, leaving you aware of smaller sounds that daytime noise drowns out. The creaking of stressed metal as temperature fluctuations cause expansion and contraction. The skittering of the vermin that infest the ventilation systems despite extermination efforts. The crying of children who have not yet learned that noise attracts attention and attention brings danger. The mumbled prayers of the faithful who cannot sleep without first reciting their devotions to the god Emperor. Dreams, when they come, blend memory and fear into narratives that provide no rest. I dream of drowning in nutrient paste, the gray, brown substance filling my lungs while I struggle against its viscous weight. I dream of the stamping press descending in slow motion while my hands remain frozen in its path, unable to move despite desperate mental commands. I dream of Sarah's face receding into distance as vast as the void between stars, her voice calling my name but growing fainter with each repetition until silence swallows it entirely. I dream of my mother's final weeks, reliving each labored breath and watching helplessly as life drains from her eyes. I dream of the quota board displaying my designation in red, 3 failures accumulated and the overseers approaching with reassignment orders that will send me to the plasma refineries where survival is measured in months. I wake from these dreams with my heart hammering against my ribs and my coveralls soaked with sweat, and the waking provides no relief because the reality I wake to differs from nightmare only in its relentless continuity, its refusal to end when consciousness returns. Some workers develop coping mechanisms that edge toward genuine madness, psychological breaks that manifest as bizarre behaviors the overseers tolerate so long as productivity remains acceptable. A woman on the level above mine spends her entire rest period arranging tiny pieces of scrap metal into intricate patterns on the floor of her Hab unit, then carefully photographing them with her mind, committing the patterns to memory before sweeping them away and beginning again. A man who operates the cargo loader in the main transport hub speaks only in rhyming couplets, transforming every interaction into impromptu poetry that ranges from absurd to unexpectedly profound. Another worker has convinced herself that she is actually a servitor that somehow retained full consciousness, that her humanity is a glitch in her programming, and she moves through her shifts with mechanical precision while referring to herself in third-person technical language. The overseers monitor these individuals but take no action unless the behavior interferes with operations, perhaps recognizing that madness represents an adaptation as valid as any other when the environment itself exceeds human capacity for rational endurance. The concept of privacy extends beyond physical space into mental territory where surveillance cannot officially reach, but where you learn to police yourself nonetheless. Every thought represents potential heresy if examined closely enough, every doubt about the rightness of the system or the Emperor's divine will. Every question about whether existence must necessarily be configured as it is. The Manufactorum preaches that faith should be absolute and unquestioning. That doubt itself constitutes failure of devotion, and this teaching transforms your internal landscape into dangerous ground where examining your own thoughts feels like diffusing explosives that might detonate if handled incorrectly. You learn to catch dangerous thoughts before they fully form, to redirect your mind away from lines of inquiry that lead toward forbidden conclusions. You learn to distinguish between the thoughts you can safely speak aloud, the thoughts you can admit to yourself in privacy, and the thoughts that must be suppressed entirely because acknowledging them even internally creates vulnerability. This constant internal monitoring consumes energy that could otherwise be directed toward productive purposes. But the alternative is allowing heresy to take root in your consciousness, and heresy leads to investigation, and investigation leads to death or worse. The Adeptus Arbites represent the Imperium's iron fist made manifest, enforcers who maintain order through the implicit and explicit threat of overwhelming violence. They patrol the Hive in squads of 4 to 6, moving through corridors with weapons visible and armor that makes them appear superhuman in scale. Their helmets conceal their faces behind reflective visors that mirror your own image back at you, forcing you to confront yourself in their presence rather than perceiving them as individuals. They rarely speak to ordinary citizens, communicating through gestures and the pointed direction of weapons when verbal instruction proves necessary. Their mere presence changes the atmosphere of any space they enter, conversations dying mid-sentence and workers suddenly discovering urgent reasons to be elsewhere. They possess authority to execute summary judgment for infractions ranging from genuine criminal activity to simple suspicion of harboring improper thoughts, and that authority is exercised frequently enough to ensure everyone understands its reality. I have seen them beat a man unconscious for failing to step aside quickly enough when their patrol passed through a crowded corridor, watched them drag him away while blood painted the floor and witnesses averted their eyes and pretended they had seen nothing at all. Their precinct fortresses rise throughout the Hive like miniature fortifications, rockcrete bunkers bristling with weapon emplacements and surveillance equipment. You learn to give these structures wide berth, to avoid even glancing directly at their walls, lest the act of observation be interpreted as suspicious reconnaissance. The interrogation chambers within these fortresses have acquired legendary status in the whispered conversations between workers, places where suspected criminals or heretics are taken and subjected to procedures designed to extract truth, regardless of cost to the subject. The few who emerge from interrogation are inevitably changed, their eyes holding a quality of permanent fear and their bodies bearing scars both visible and hidden. Most do not emerge at all, classified as guilty regardless of any evidence to the contrary, and their execution is carried out efficiently in the fortress's secure areas before their bodies are processed through standard reclamation channels. Justice in the Imperium is not about determining truth or ensuring fair treatment. Justice is about maintaining order and eliminating threats with sufficient spectacle to deter others from similar behavior. The surveillance systems that monitor the Hive operate with varying degrees of sophistication depending on location and strategic importance. The manufactorums bristle with recording equipment, thousands of optical sensors and audio collectors that track every worker's movement and speech throughout their shift. The overseers maintain monitoring stations where they observe wall-sized displays showing dozens of simultaneous feeds, watching for signs of reduced productivity or unauthorized behavior. The HAB blocks receive less intensive surveillance, optical sensors positioned at major corridor intersections, but with substantial gaps in coverage that create pockets of relative privacy. The deep maintenance levels and abandoned sections possess almost no functional surveillance at all, equipment that has degraded over decades without replacement because those areas hold no strategic value worth monitoring. These surveillance-free zones become refuges for those who need to speak or act without observation, though accessing them requires navigating through restricted areas where your presence itself constitutes a violation that could warrant severe punishment if detected. The educated among us, those rare individuals who somehow acquired literacy beyond basic comprehension, occupy positions of peculiar status within the social hierarchy. They serve as intermediaries between the illiterate masses and the administrative bureaucracy that governs every aspect of our lives, interpreting the endless documentation and notices that arrive periodically through official channels. A man named Torval in my district possessed this skill, having learned to read as a child when his father held a position in the district record, keeping office, and passed the knowledge to his son before a workplace accident claimed his life. Torval would sit in the communal areas during rest periods with workers lined up to request his assistance deciphering official notices, quota adjustments, or the rare personal messages that occasionally arrived through military channels when someone's family member died serving in the Astra Militarum somewhere across the galaxy. He charged modest fees for this service, usually portions of rations or small amounts of thrown geld, and he maintained strict confidentiality about what he read, understanding that trust was essential to his continued livelihood. The illiterate majority depended on people like Torval, and that dependence granted him influence disproportionate to his official position, a form of soft power that he wielded with admirable restraint. Education for ordinary citizens' children consisted of basic literacy instruction delivered in mandatory sessions twice weekly, teaching them to recognize their names, read simple instructions, and comprehend the devotional texts used during prayer services. Mathematics extended only to basic arithmetic necessary for tracking quota numbers and ration allotments. History was presented as religious narrative, the Emperor's Great Crusade, and the Horus Heresy reduced to morality plays about loyalty and betrayal with all complexity stripped away. Science was not taught at all, deemed unnecessary for workers whose function required only that they follow instructions and maintain existing systems. This limited education served its purpose perfectly, producing citizens capable of performing their designated roles while lacking the intellectual tools necessary to question the structure that governed their lives. Knowledge represented power, and power concentrated in the hands of those who ruled rather than those who labored, a calculated arrangement that ensured the system's perpetuation across generations. The industrial accidents that claimed lives weekly in the manufactorums represented only the most visible form of death in the hive. Disease killed more slowly but more thoroughly. Bacterial and viral infections that spread through crowded hab, blocks where hundreds shared contaminated air and limited ablution facilities. Respiratory illnesses were endemic, everyone developing chronic coughs that persisted for months or years, sometimes clearing temporarily before recurring with renewed vigor. Skin infections emerged from the constant contact with industrial chemicals and the inability to maintain proper hygiene with limited water access. Digestive ailments resulted from the nutrient paste's variable quality and occasional contamination, leaving you doubled over with cramps that felt like someone had filled your intestines with broken glass. The medicus stations treated only conditions that threatened immediate death or total incapacitation, dispensing basic antibiotics and pain suppressants while leaving chronic conditions to run their course. You learn to function through illness, to maintain productivity despite fever or pain, because allowing sickness to reduce your output meant red numbers on the quota board and consequences that outweighed any physical suffering. The psychology of survival in this environment required careful calibration between hope and acceptance. Too much hope left you vulnerable to crushing disappointment when circumstances inevitably failed to improve, while too much acceptance transformed you into a hollow shell going through motions without any internal life beyond mechanical function. The ideal state existed somewhere between these extremes, maintaining enough hope to preserve motivation while accepting enough reality to avoid the paralysis of constant disappointment. I learned this balance gradually over decades, adjusting my expectations downward until they aligned with what existence actually offered rather than what I wished it might offer. Small pleasures became sufficient because they were all that remained available. A conversation that made me laugh, a batch of nutrient paste slightly better than usual, a night's sleep undisturbed by nightmares. These fragments of not quite happiness accumulated into a life that, while terrible by any objective measure, still contained moments worth experiencing. The elderly workers who had survived long enough to accumulate genuine wisdom sometimes shared insights that transformed how you perceived the system that ground us all beneath its gears. One woman named Hestia, bent nearly double from decades of stooping to service low machinery, told me during a rest period that the secret was remembering that you were not the machine. The system wanted you to internalize its values completely, to measure your worth entirely through productivity and contribution scores, to believe that failing to meet quota made you genuinely worthless rather than simply underperforming arbitrary standards. Resisting this internalization required constant effort, maintaining some core of self that existed independent of the role you performed and the numbers that tracked your labor. She said that her grandmother had told her this, and her grandmother's grandmother before that, knowledge passed down through generations of women who had worked these same manufactorums under slightly different configurations, but fundamentally identical conditions. Preserving this knowledge represented a form of rebellion so subtle that the system could not detect it, yet maintaining it made the difference between surviving as a person rather than being eroded into a component. The future stretched ahead with the same relentless monotony as the past, an endless procession of shifts and quotas and rest periods that would continue until my body finally failed and the corpse collection servitors came to transport me to the reclamation facilities. No possibility existed for improvement or escape. No path that led anywhere except deeper into the system that had consumed every aspect of my existence. The younger workers still harbored fantasies about somehow distinguishing themselves, earning promotions to administrative positions or specialist roles that offered better conditions. But those positions existed in numbers so limited that aspiring to them was statistically indistinguishable from fantasy. For every 1,000 workers, grinding through identical shifts, perhaps one would advance to something marginally better. And that one success story would be held up as proof that the system rewarded merit, while the 999 failures were forgotten as irrelevant data points. I had stopped entertaining such fantasies years ago, accepted that the station where I now stood represented the peak of whatever arc my life would trace. That training new workers was as good as circumstances would become before death claimed me. Yet despite everything, despite the grinding brutality and the absence of hope, and the knowledge that my existence held no meaning beyond my contribution to production quotas, we all continued. We rose when the shift alarms sounded and moved to our stations and performed our designated functions with whatever skill we could muster. We collected our rations and returned to our hab units, and tried to find brief moments of rest before beginning the cycle again. We maintained the relationships that gave life texture despite their fragility and impermanence. We told our stories and listened to others' stories and preserved whatever fragments of culture we could pass to the next generation. We prayed to the God Emperor and believed, or tried to believe, or at least performed belief convincingly enough to avoid investigation. We survived because survival was the only option available, and because somewhere in the genetic legacy of humanity existed an adaptation for enduring conditions that should, by all rational assessment, break us entirely. The Imperium of Man spans 1,000,000 worlds and contains uncounted trillions of souls, a civilization so vast that comprehending its scale exceeds human cognitive capacity. The wars that rage across the galaxy involve forces that could sterilize planets, weapons that tear reality itself, enemies that would consume or corrupt or destroy everything we are. The space marines who defend humanity are living weapons, crafted from genetic material derived from the Emperor himself. Warriors who transcend humanity to become something simultaneously more and less than human. The Adeptus Mechanicus maintains technology so ancient and powerful that its operation borders on the miraculous. Machines that predate the Imperium by millennia and whose construction methods are lost to history. The Imperial Navy commands void ships kilometers long that wage battles across star systems, deploying firepower that makes our manufactorum's entire output seem like a child's toy. All of this exists beyond the walls of our hive, beyond our world, in a cosmos so filled with wonders and horrors that our limited existence seems almost irrelevant by comparison. But everything, all of it, every Space Marine's bolter, and every Navy warship's macro, cannon, and every Forge world's titanic plasma reactor, everything depends on the work of people like us. The billions upon billions of ordinary humans who mine the ore and refine the metals and stamp the shell casings and assemble the components and load the transport ships and perform the 10,000 other tasks that transform raw material into the Imperium's military might. We are the foundation upon which everything else is built, the vast pyramid's base that supports the tiny apex where heroes and legends operate. Our suffering makes their glory possible. Our deaths, meaningless individually, aggregate into the statistical cushion that allows the Imperium to absorb catastrophic losses and continue functioning. We are told this is noble, that our sacrifice serves the Emperor's divine will and contributes to humanity's survival. We are told that faith and duty should make us grateful for the opportunity to serve. We are told that questioning this arrangement represents heresy against the natural order that the Emperor established when he unified humanity during the Great Crusade millennia ago. I do not know if any of this is true. I possess no framework for evaluating theological claims or assessing whether the Imperium's configuration represents genuine necessity or merely one possible arrangement among many alternatives. The education I received was designed specifically to prevent me from developing the intellectual tools that would enable such evaluation. Perhaps the Emperor truly is divine, and his design for humanity represents the only path that avoids extinction. Perhaps the suffering we endure is genuinely necessary, the minimum price required to maintain civilization against threats so terrible that we are deliberately kept ignorant of their nature. Or perhaps the system perpetuates itself primarily because those with power benefit from its continuation and possess sufficient force to crush any challenge to their authority. I will never know the answer because determining the answer requires information I cannot access and analytical capabilities I was never permitted to develop. What I know with absolute certainty is this: I have lived for 40 years in conditions that strip away everything except the barest essence of survival. I have watched people I cared about die from causes that could have been prevented if their lives were valued more than the resources required to save them. I have spent 3 decades performing labor that destroyed my body incrementally, accumulating injuries and degradation that will ensure my remaining years involve increasing pain and decreasing capability. I have inhabited spaces designed with such contempt for human comfort that calling them dehumanizing seems insufficient to capture their hostility to flourishing. I have consumed food that provides calories but no pleasure, breathed air that sustains life but damages health, and existed in a state of constant low-level fear that any misstep might trigger consequences ranging from reduction in rations to summary execution. This is the reality of civilian life in Segmentum Solar, the daily existence of billions of souls whose names will never be recorded in any history and whose deaths will be noted only as adjustments to production capacity projections. We are not heroes. We do not save worlds or slay monsters or perform deeds worthy of legend. We simply endure day after day, shift after shift, generation after generation, maintaining the industrial base that makes everything else possible. The Imperium grinds us down and processes our remains and continues its march across the stars. And whether that continuation justifies the cost remains a question I am not qualified to answer. The shift alarm sounds through the Vox grills, its harsh electronic tone cutting through whatever thoughts occupied my mind. My body responds automatically, muscle memory accumulated over decades directing me through the motions of rising from my sleeping pallet and pulling on coveralls still stiff with yesterday's dried sweat. The corridor outside fills with workers moving toward their assigned stations, thousands of individuals flowing through passages worn smooth by the shuffle of millions of feet over centuries. I join this flow because I have always joined this flow, because the alternative is unthinkable, and because somewhere beneath the exhaustion and resignation and accumulated damage, something in me still chooses to continue. Not hope exactly, or faith, or duty, but something more fundamental. The simple animal determination to persist that exists deeper than conscious thought, that keeps you moving even when every rational assessment suggests that stopping would be mercy. The manufactorum floor stretches before me, an expanse of machinery and noise and workers already beginning their shifts. I move to my station where today's group of new trainees waits with eyes still capable of showing fear. They are young, 13 or 14 standard years, and they watch me with the desperate attention of people who understand that the knowledge I possess might mean the difference between life and mutilation. I begin the familiar routine of instruction, showing them the proper stance and hand positioning, explaining the rhythm of the stamping press and the importance of maintaining concentration despite exhaustion. My voice carries the flat effect of someone who has repeated these words so many times that their meaning has eroded into pure sound. But I continue because this is what I do, because training the next generation of workers is the function I have been assigned. One of the trainees, a girl with eyes that remind me painfully of Sarah's, asks me how long I have worked here. 40 years, I tell her, and watch something die behind those eyes as she calculates what that means, extrapolates my current state across the decades she can expect to endure. She does not ask the question I can see forming in her mind, the one about whether it gets easier, because she has already learned that some questions have no answers worth hearing. Instead, she nods and turns her attention to the machine, beginning to practice the motions I demonstrated, and I watch her small hands move through the sequence that will define her existence for however long she survives. The stamping press begins its cycle, hydraulic arms rising and falling with mechanical precision, and the sound of metal striking metal fills the air with its familiar thunder. Around me, thousands of workers perform their designated functions, component parts in the vast machine of the Imperium that grinds endlessly forward toward whatever future awaits humanity in the darkness between stars. We are the foundation. We are the forgotten billions. We are the price of survival in a galaxy that offers no mercy and accepts no excuses. And we continue because continuing is what humans do. Because 10,000 years of civilization built on suffering has not yet broken our species' capacity to endure one more shift, one more day, one more generation of service to the God, Emperor's eternal design. This is the truth they do not speak in the propaganda broadcasts or the manufactorum sermons. This is the reality that lies beneath the glory and legend. This is civilian life in Segmentum Solar, and it is the life of trillions across the Imperium's million worlds. We who live and die in darkness so that distant stars might burn bright with humanity's light.